This is the poisoned chalice part of the afternoon. Brenda Hyman, who conceived and organized today's event, has asked me to talk about Wembley Synagogue's 90 years on this site. That means she wants me to remember and name as many people as possible who contributed actively to the life at 40 Avenue. And you know, I'm going to fail. There are over 300 people here, and at least 290 of you are going to go home grumbling that I missed you out, and I missed out your parents, and I missed out your bar mitzvah. Doesn't he know that for 6 months I used to launder the socks of the youth club's football team? I think that deserves a mention. You think you deserve a mention? I used to supply tea bags to the Ladies' Guild. Used to schlep them from Leslie's on a Sunday morning, on my own. Never got any help, had to dart across Preston Road, took my life in my hands. What I'm saying is, you're probably not going to get a name check. If you want to sue, sue. My solicitors are Lazels in Muswell Hill. Ask for a man called Jack, he charges £300 an hour. So, here we all are again. It's nice to be back, isn't it? You never left. I know, you never left. For years and years, you've been coming back to Wembley Shul for a Malava Malka, or a grease paint production, or the choral Salichot services, and deep inside you, you know that this is where your heart belongs. Yes, you do. You may have moved to Stanmore in the 1960s or 70s, or Bushy and Pinner in the 1980s, or Boreham Wood in the 90s, or somewhere called Radlett in the 2000s. And you're perfectly happy there, but it's not the same, because this is where you come from. This is where your history is. And this afternoon, we're going to refresh that history and awaken some of your memories of the great days of Rabbi Berman, if you go back that far, or the beauty of Steve Robbins's Chazanut, or the atmosphere created by Myrna Glass for the children at Yavneh, or how, on Yom Kippur, the choir's singing helped us get through the day with musical stepping stones that punctuated the davening. I think punctuated is the right word. So let's go back to those richly musical days for a moment. The choir was started by Arnold Chazen in 1966 and taken over by the wonderful Lou Jackson, who'll always be associated with it. After Lou had a heart attack, Myrna Glass's son Stephen picked up the baton, then Elkin Pressman, and Leon Rose, and Lawrence Lederman, and Harvey Pollins, and then me for a few years. So I'm going to ask David Druce, who took over from me in 2004, if he'd be good enough to conduct his own choir, the Cantorials, here they are, in one of those performances that used to ruin your sleep during the day of rest. If you don't find their singing spellbinding, just sit and chat like you used to in the old days.
Hayom
was Hayom Senu, sung by the choir with soloist Henry Black, and I think I caught David Druce duetting a little bit there. It was composed by Yoshev Rosenblatt. There's a picture of him. Probably the greatest cantor of his time. He was born in Ukraine in 1882, sang in his Shul Choir as a boy, became famous for his singing tours of Austro-Hungary, and starred in the Al Jolson film, The Jazz Singer. That was the upside. Then it all went wrong. He went bankrupt after being asked to back a new Jewish newspaper in New York, which went bust. And he ended up in Mandatory Palestine, where he died of a heart attack. Moral of the story, if you're a chazan, stick to chazan. There was a time back in the mid-1970s when Wembley was one of the biggest United Synagogue communities with a membership of about 1,500 families, which meant it was right up there with Hendon and Kinloss and Stanmore. For a community that hadn't existed 40 years earlier, its growth rate was astonishing. It was the British Empire exhibition that had put Wembley on the map in 1924, attracting 27 million visitors in 2 years. At the same time, new housing was going up fast. This was Metroland, and the line from the railway line from the Chilterns to Baker Street in the city catalyzed house building with fashionable, superior homes on the Barn Hill side of the tracks, and on the other side, more affordable housing all the way up to Preston Road and around the GEC factory at North Wembley and clustered around Wembley Hill on the edge of Empire Way. House builders of the time advertised, and I'm quoting from their adverts, advertised the extensive views of well-wooded, gently undulating countryside. I read that a week or so ago and chuckled. There may have been some gently undulating countryside and well-wooded fields before the house builders came, I thought. And then all the new houses ruined it. But then I went back to see for myself. It's all still there. There, on Friant Fields, where the grass is allowed to grow chest high until it's cut in June. And on the northern slopes of Barn Hill, which my father fought to prevent the local authority from building on. There really was a good reason to come and live in Wembley, out of the smoke. And imagine this, there was no Asda or Lidl. I know, it's amazing. And yet, these new homes attracted Jewish families, and by 1928, 2 years after the Empire exhibition had closed, those families started holding services in their homes. The idea of creating the Wembley Hebrew congregation was confirmed at a meeting in September 1928. At the start of 1929, the first Hebrew classes was formed with 12 children. A ladies' guild was set up the year later, in February 1930, and United Synagogue affiliation came in 1931. At first, festival services had to be held in commercial premises, in Union Hall, just past the old Regal Cinema there in Ealing Road, now a Hindu temple. In Mitchell's Restaurant, in Wembley High Road, now a Hindu restaurant. And later, in the Capitol Ballroom in Empire Way, now a Hindu housing complex. Then, at the end of 1931, and with membership at 64, the committee bought the land we're now on, here, next to the alleyway connecting Oakington Avenue with its model homes built for the Daily Mail Ideal Home Exhibition of 1928, yes, and Beechcroft Gardens with its pretty little bungalows. For 25 years or so, services took place on this site in a Nissen hut called The Hut, which famously leaked. And we weren't the only United Synagogue shul that started up in northwest London in the 1920s. Warm Lane Synagogue in Cricklewood was founded in 1923 and started its first services in a hut, which they called The Hut. Hendon was founded in 1926 and met initially in a hut, which they called the Hut. On the 22nd of April 1934, Wembley's foundation stone was laid by Sir Isidore Salmon, the Conservative MP for the Harrow constituency, which then included Wembley, and from 1929, chairman of J. Lyons, the chain of stylish tea shops and corner houses famous for its uniformed waitresses, known as nippies, but not for its salmon sandwiches. And Sir Isidore's the one on the left. Events now moved quickly. In the summer of 34, Reverend Meyer Berman agreed to become the Shul's minister, and the status of the synagogue was raised to that of a district synagogue, with the chief rabbi, Joseph Hertz, consecrating the Hut as a fully fledged synagogue on the 2nd of September. So that was the key year, 1934, 88 years ago, when Wembley became official. Reconstructing those early days for the historian isn't easy. At some point in the 1990s, one of our beloved Gaboim decided that the Shul's archive material was taking up too much space and threw most of it away. What we do know is that Shul got its first Sefer Torah in August 1936. And the house next door to 40 Avenue, that's sort of there, was bought in November 1939, just a couple of months after the war had begun. And with the war, Reverend Berman, as he was then, was whisked off to be a chaplain to the forces in Northern Ireland, North Africa, and the Mediterranean. And he was awarded the MBE in 1944 for gallant and distinguished services. He didn't return until 1946 when he was demobbed. Reverend Vennett stood in for him during his absence. And now we're in the run-up to the building of the building. The assumption had been that the site, where we are, where the hut had been, and 40 Avenue next door, would be large enough for a shul. But by 1949, 4 years after the war, with families bombed out of the East End moving to the suburbs, it was becoming obvious that something much bigger was going to be needed. Not just a synagogue, but a social hall with classrooms and an office and a caretaker's flat. And so the next door house at 1040 Avenue was also bought. And it's ironic to think that after all that growth, the Wembley community is now going to shrink down and fit into a single house. The Shul's archives may have been chucked out, but I do have a copy of the annual report from 1951. What a lovely little advert that is for Go by Travelux. Radio taxi service, 1951, this is only the most modern in Wembley. And the annual report of 51 shows just how lively the Shul was at the time. 6 years after the end of the war, it could boast a busy cheder. It ran Gemara Shiurim on Shabbos afternoons, not fantastically well attended. Fay Green ran the Ladies' Guild, which held Wednesday afternoon meetings. Fanny Brotman ran the Wembley branch of the League of Jewish Women. Joseph Clapman, husband of the famous Bessie Clapman of the Hall, chaired the Joint Palestine Appeal, and Beatrice Barwell, Trixie Barwell, the JPA's vice chairman, also chaired the Zionist Society. Then there was a Mizrahi Society, a Young Israel Society, chaired by Gerald Don and Audrey Gilbert, B'nai Akiva, led by Bernard Schiff, as well as Bachad, Ajax, and a Literary and Social Society, Litsoc, as well as a Wembley kindergarten about to be started by Rose Rubin and Deborah Walkenfeld. Deborah Walkenfeld, before she changed her name to Devorah after the terrible death of her daughter. The 19th Wembley Boy Scout group was just being set up and would be closely followed by the 5th Wembley Park Guides and the 5th Wembley Park Brownie Pack. Dib, 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 we'll dob, dob, dob. Dunk your bagels, dunk your bagels, dunk your bagels. We dunk our bagels, dunk our bagels, dunk our bagels. I think Joe Radbill, was that right, Michael, started the Scouts. And they were supported by Rabbi Berman, who took a leading role in the Jewish student, youth, and scouting movements in London, as well as being president of the Union of Anglo-Jewish Preachers. How could there have been so much activity in this shul? And by the way, the honorary officers complained in their report for 1951-52 that while Shabbos morning attendance had been very good, decorum was not all that could be desired. Is that possible? By then, 1952, 21 years after services had begun on this site, membership had grown to 664 male or family members and another 74 single lady members, a 4% increase over the previous year, which meant that the shul was already needing to hire Wembley Town Hall for overflow services at the Yom Memoriam. In those days, the early 50s, Wembley could break even on a revenue of just £6,500 a year, 1,000 of which paid for the shul's Hebrew classes. In 1952, there were 5 weddings and 14 bar mitzvahs. No bat mitzvahs in those days, sorry. And by the time that Wembley became a full constituent member of the United Synagogue at the start of 1956, as the Chief Rabbi mentioned earlier, we had the largest cheder of any United Synagogue shul. That theme of our children and the succession of generations also, as the Chief Rabbi mentioned just now, prompts memories of a favorite song, sung now by cantors Steve Robbins and David Rome, and a small group from the Cantorial Singers, Vador by Meir Finkelstein.
Vador, 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 Vador.
Vador sung quotets with soloist Steve Robbins and David Rome. The composer
is, or was at one time, my brother-in-law, Meir Finkelstein. Meir was married to my wife's older sister, became a cantor at a big Los Angeles shul, and composes extensively. And if you saw Michaela Coel's award-winning BBC drama I May Destroy You, you may have seen that Michaela used some of Mayer's music. And the arrangement for voices was by Stephen Glass, who now lives in Canada, where he continues to write and arrange Jewish music. We've got to the point when the synagogue we all know and love started to appear out of the ground. It was actually the classroom wing that got built first on the site of the two houses. Once it was up, the hut was demolished to build the shul, which meant the services had to be held in the classrooms for a while. Building work caused a lot of disruption, but what's amazingly noticeable in the reports of the times is the communal spirit, the sense of all working together, something the building committee commented on in 1956. It said, "There is such a happy and harmonious atmosphere resulting in the fullest cooperation and loyalty among members of the committee that from time to time, new members join the ranks, giving new strength, new ideas, and greater impetus." And new members must indeed have been queuing up to join, because by 1956, the building committee had 41 members, as well as an executive committee of 15. And they were bringing in as much money from fundraising as the shul made in membership fees. Among the many social events set up to make money, Wembley held its first dinner dance, which did so well that everyone said it should become an annual highlight in the life of the congregation. Mixed dancing, ladies and gentlemen. And in a shul where even the rabbi went bareheaded at social events on shul premises. Also very popular was Wembley's annual boxing tournament, in which the rabbis of northwest London took the opportunity to beat each other to pulp. That's Diane Kaplan just landing a nasty punch on Rabbi Landy of Warm Lane. And notice, they're also not wearing kippot. It wasn't felt necessary in those days. Happy times, before the changing character of the Beth Din required member synagogues of the US to crank up their religiosity, and dances got banned. In those days, many members would carry their talesim to shul in a tallis bag. That was what a tallis bag was for, wasn't it? And older members might remember the exodus, not that exodus, the exodus of men from the rabbi's sermon on a weekday Yom Tov in order to get in a couple of cigarettes before coming back for Musaf. As you look around the shul, you'll be aware of one of the most impressive collections of synagogue art in the whole of the country. Of the 62 shuls that make up the United Synagogue today, Wembley's are undoubtedly the best, the most sophisticated artistically, the most imaginative in their composition and use of colour, head and shoulders above those at St. John's Wood Synagogue, which was built at about the same time. The windows offer visual encapsulations of the festivals and upstairs of the tribes, but also they offer manipulation of light at various times in the service. I always remember a shaft of blue light streaming through that window there during the prayer for Israel. Beyond that, there's the bit that no one gives much notice to, the names endowed in memory of loved ones. I think we should look at them. Can we look at the names? My estate agent father thought that to raise funds for the next half century, these old names should be treated not as freeholders, but as lessees, and that they should be evicted after 50 years, so the spaces could be rented out to new occupants on a system of assured short-hold tenancies. Fortunately, it didn't happen, of course, which is why, sadly, most of us now don't recognize those who continue to occupy their place of honor in the building. This afternoon may be your last opportunity to pay your respects to them. Annual reports record who the movers and shakers were when this building was put up. The Monats, the Sklans, the Kaufmans, the Kuttners, the Mailmans, the Elmans, the Offsteins, the Gilberts, the Schiffs. I'm pulling names out at random here. In those days, Shabbos services were led by Chazan Louis Klein, and in the town hall at Rosh Hashanah by Eric Wolkenfeld, whose father had been a cantor in Germany, in Emden, I think. Eric also led Shabbos and Yom Tov services in the gap between Chazan Klein and Chazan Meir Lev, who joined the shul in May 1958. For the Yomim Nerayim, we also rented St. Cuthbert's Parish Church. Yes, exactly. On the southern, can you see, it's always forgotten, we only talk about the town hall, but there was St. Cuthbert's as well. Yes, on the southern corner of Northwick Park, where Sudbury Court Drive meets Watford Way, where we were allowed to drape a cloth over the crucifix so members didn't forget who they were supposed to be praying to. In those days also, volunteers were given a formal thanks for helping out as stewards and ushers at the High Holidays overflow services, and they were needed. In 1957, some 1,300 people attended the services at Wembley Town Hall, with another 330 crammed into a service in the new classroom wing. And that's in addition to those who were davening here, where, as you'll remember, the back wall used to be removed so that people chatting away where you're sitting could be distracted by the sound of people chatting away at the very back. Those were the great days when the Gaboim really had their work cut out, keeping sound levels down. They were helped. You may remember, in this context, the wonderful Sidney Kroner, part of the German cohort of the Shul, who took it upon himself to call out, "Quiet!" during the learning, and sometimes, "It's a disgrace!" and even, "Am haratzim!" Wonderful rolled R, and he used to sit there, and who on one occasion slammed his bookrest down like a thunderclap, to the great surprise, shall we say, of Eric Wolkenfeld, who had been half asleep in the seat in front. There was a time, after the new building had opened, when the Board of Management must have felt it was running a small city, or a decent-sized village anyway. To put it in context, Wembley Shul, the 1950s, was about the size that a Cotswold beauty spot like Burford is now, or that Chipping Camden or Stow-on-the-Wold were then. The Board of Management was effectively a parish council. I read out to you before some of the organisations that were operating out of Wembley Shul in those days. Only a year or so later, in 1959, 450 children were enrolled in Hebrew classes, with lessons having to be housed, do you remember? Where? At Preston Manor School. There was now a kosher meal service operating from the Shul kitchen. In addition to the Scouts and Guides and Brownies, we had a Cub Pack, the Wembley Jewish Youth Club, a Parents Association, a Wheatso Group, a Friendship Club that met every Tuesday afternoon, and a branch of the League of Jewish Women. All these groups were run by committees, and some of the committees had subcommittees, and you could only get on the committee if you stood for election, and the elections were hotly contested. Look at this, if you can see a screen. A ballot paper from the Literary and Social Society in 1955 with 5 executive posts and 12 candidates for the 8-person committee. There's enthusiasm for you. Every month or so, some shul committee was holding an election. It was a bit like living in Israel today. And the committees had to plan programs of events as much as a year in advance and find accommodation for meetings either on site or in members' homes, and integrate all of this with what other committees were planning, and in a way that didn't clash with religious events. In the early archives of Litzok, which still exist, you can find the banqueting manager of the Rest Hotel and Carlton Rooms in Kenton accepting a booking for a dance at the end of the month, and then Len Musicant and his orchestra actually a trio if you read the small print, agreeing to play at another dance at the Rest Hotel 5 months later at a fee of £7 10 shillings. Here are replies from the BAFTA and Oscar winner Wolf Mankiewicz, author of A Kid for Two Farthings, agreeing in January to give a talk in April, and Rabbi Koppel Rosen, headmaster of Carmel College, saying in July that he wouldn't be available for a talk in September, and I think inviting another offer. Now, multiply that by all the other invitations being sent out by all other groups, and think of the logistic challenge of getting everything synchronized. Wembley Shul was a massive machine, and all these activities needed funding, for which there were fundraising committees, including the Combined Charities Fund, which lasted, I think, Charles, until 2006. So, now we have a shul, and a mass of activities taking place inside and outside. And one event that brought shul members back on Saturday evenings were the Melava Malkas, with a range of entertainments. I remember, do you remember, Rabbi Jeffrey Schisler, the only rabbi member of the Magic Circle, I think, coming to astonish us. There were occasions also when my piano-playing mother, Sheila, would accompany our beloved Chazanim, Anthony Wolfson, for example, in selections of songs, liturgical and secular. There were show songs. I remember Memory from Cats, Memory, Turn Your Face to the Moonlight, and duets from Fiddler on the Roof. Do you love me? Do I what? But there are also songs that people knew from religious services. Here's one song that always went down well. Dovid, written by David Reutman and Joseph Rumchinsky. There they are on the screens. Both were born in or near Vilna in the early 1880s and ended up in America for the worst possible of reasons. Reutman fled to Ukraine after a pogrom, after his shul in Leningrad was destroyed in the Russian Revolution. Rumchinsky wrote a funeral march to commemorate the Kishinev pogrom of 1903, which he had witnessed, and then went on to make a career in New York's Yiddish theatre. Any celebration of our time at 40 Avenue means reminding ourselves of who was who and who did what in the shul. Over the course of 94 years, nearly a century, the community was led by a series of remarkable Rabbanim. After Rabbi Berman came Rabbi Ivor Abrams, then Rabbis Yisroel Fine, David Radomski, the lovely Martin Vandenberg with Anna, and Simon Harris. And you may remember the shock of losing Rabbi Abrams. He died suddenly and unexpectedly in February 1981, and nearly 1,000 congregants, as well as other guests, came to his memorial service in Shul later in the month. Looking back, I see tributes to him from our MP at the time and from Chief Rabbi Emanuel Jakobowitz, who complimented him on setting up Wembley's first Chevra Kadisha, and from staff and inmates of Wormwood Scrubs prison, where Rabbi Abrams had been chaplain for 15 years. Shuls are more formal organizations than they are today. One wore one's Saturday best, and such was the authority of the rabbi that there was competition to sit in the block closest to the rabbi's throne. If the floor of the shul had been a Monopoly board, this is where Mayfair and Park Lane would have been. That block, you lot, would have been Bond Street, Oxford Street, and Regent Street. You, at the back, would have been Piccadilly, Coventry Street, and Leicester Square. Dad and I sat in Whitechapel Road and Old Kent Road. No hotels. But we did have Eric Walkenfeld and Ben Helfgott to protect us. Ben was an Olympic weightlifter after the war. Eric had been a boxer and actually wrote the guide on male physical strength for Maccabi. It's good to be surrounded by a bit of muscle. Upstairs, the ladies' gallery isn't so obviously divided into blocks, but it could also be territorial. And in the days when the rabbi's wife came to shul, the power seat was where she sat, dead in the center of the front row. More recently, I feel it shifted to where our last chairman of the Ladies' Guild, Maureen, sat, just to the right of the Rebbitzin seat and just a little bit up, but in a direct line through to where Leon used to stand among the second tenors in the choir gallery. That's been the new center of power in the Ladies' Gallery, and the only way to contest it was to wear a very big hat. And I'm thinking Rita Pelton, but going back further, I'm thinking Gloria Mound, who made her own hats with concoctions of rather terrifying feathers. There were, however, individuals who wished not to define themselves by their adjacency to the rabbi or rebbitzin, but to Teure. And gentlemen may remember two brothers who seated themselves symbolically as the twin pillars of the shul, Justin and Ludwig Beer. One in the seat farthest to the left at the back, and one in the seat farthest to the right, from where they could monitor everything that went on and judge it accordingly. We remember their children too. Max and Miriam, Esther, and Michael, who as a boy seemed to own the bimah, police its access, and ensure that it was always properly stocked. The Bears were probably unique in defining themselves as brothers by sitting apart. The Berenblatt brothers, for example, Martin Berenblatt and Maurice Berenblatt, would sit together. And the Buckmans, Irving and Barry, sang together in the choir, Irving as a tenor and Barry as a baritone. Not sure why all my examples begin with a B. Some tribes didn't cluster together in shuls because they already lived in clusters. At the top of the Wembley pecking order were the folk who lived on the hill, Barn Hill, populated by the Reismans before they moved to Marsh Hall, and Carol and Maury Berenblatt, and Sue Levitt and her brother David, and the Frankels and the Sokowskis, and the Wilmans and the Silvermans, and the Radbills and the Schaffers. Other members lived near the town hall, like the Brockmans, Fanny and Adolf, Charles and Cynthia Gershony, and the Van Collies and the Corrals. Do you remember Joe Corral, the owner of the chain of bookies? Win £50 free every Shabbos. And those big houses on the paddocks were pretty posh, and Salmon Street, where the Grants lived. Then there were the families who lived on Hollycroft Avenue and Carlton Avenue East, like the Andresias and the Walkenfelds. And those who walked all the way from Preston Road, like the inspirational Rabbi Irving Jacobs, one-time head of Jews College, who went on to lead the Dovid Ishag synagogue near where Woodcock Hill meets the Mall. Or the Mall, as we should say. It's the Mall. We're not Americans here. Then there were families who lived in the triangle between Wembley Park Drive, Wembley Hill Road, and Empire Way. Harvey and Diana Pollins, Dinky Pollins, and most notably Leslie and Gloria Mound, who ran the grocery shop, where Leslie meticulously cut slices of smoked salmon and had a machine that sliced bread, which was the greatest thing since sliced. And where Gloria sat at the till and roared, "Take a basket!" which became the title of her autobiography. And who else around there? The two Dr. Hymans, Carl and Brenda Hyman on Wembley Park Drive, and on Wembley Hill Road, Dr. Harry Hyman, who broke away from Wembley Shul to set up a minyan in his own home. I know. The trouble with setting up a breakaway minyan in your own home is, if you're still not happy, you have to move out. Dad, don't leave us. I'm sorry, girls, I'm not hanging around here with your mother if we can't start Ein Kamocha until 9:30. Then there were the families who lived on the south side of East Lane around Clarendon Gardens and Castleton Avenue and Roslyn Crescent, the Freemans and Lou and Lily Jackson and Rabbi Fine and the Brills and the Lewises and the Cowans. And the members, this is going to go on a while, I'm sorry. And the members who lived on the other side of East Lane in Blenheim Gardens and St. Augustine's Avenue, the Roses, the Pelters, David and Bernice, Rabbi Vandenberg and Rita Pelton. And those who lived just over the railway bridge past the GEC factory, like the Wisemans and Jeffrey and Janice Peltz, and Bob and Judith Barnett and the Stewarts. And those way away in Sudbury, like the Guzzes and the Van Gelders and the Slonimses and the Cecinis and the Wilsons and the Shaws. Are we done? Oh, okay. We Wembleyites covered quite a lot of territory in all our geographical tribes, but we were also quite used to invading each other's territories. And Marcel Berenblatt reminded me the other day of something I'd forgotten. It was quite normal in the heyday of Wembley to go to the Shul Kiddush after the Shabbos morning service and then be invited back to someone for a second Kiddush before going home or going out for lunch. So that by the time you sat down to eat, it was already quite late and you'd walked your legs off and you were already quite full and maybe a little pickled. And if you'd been a member of the Pickled Herring Club, which was started by Brenda Hyman's father, Sam Ehrenberg, after he moved here from Cricklewood Shul, you'd have got yourself a bit more pickled on whiskey and brandy during the rabbi's sermon. Now, this intermediary Kiddush phenomenon between Kiddush and lunch is something Marcel said he'd not seen at other shuls. He felt it pointed to how well integrated Wembley's families were, one with another, how permeable our homes were, and how much of a great big family we were. There were no age barriers, everyone knew everyone took care of each other. We weren't just separate congregants. Absolutely right. And I thought, if you were thinking of studying for a PhD in sociology, there are rich pickings here in looking at how we all operated. And there is probably no one better to act as your doctoral supervisor in this than Jonathan Gershony, one of Charles Gershony's 3 sons, member of the British Academy, emeritus professor of sociology at Oxford. Jonathan is part of another little Wembley nexus, the nexus of academics. At one time, we had as many as 7 professors among our members in Wembley, just about. As well as Jay, there was Michael Freeman, professor of English law at UCL, Avram Guz, professor of medicine at Charing Cross and Westminster Medical School, and Brian Cowan, professor in low-temperature physics at Royal Holloway. In addition, Maurice Assini had been professor of marketing and economic analysis at the University of Alberta before returning to England. Harold Mirsky was professor in psychiatry at the University of Western Ontario, and Albert Churns left us to become professor of social science at Loughborough University. Now, I don't have any data, but this seems like an unprecedented number for any US shul. And that's not to mention other lecturing staff like Lou Jackson, our choir master for so many years. And I have to stop here and apologize. I don't have data on the appointments of our women's members. And I'm aware of the absence, and I feel it. In those days, career advancement was still skewed heavily towards men. So although we had a lot of very smart women in the community, few were high flyers in the public and corporate and academic worlds, as far as I'm aware. One who was Sam Stamler's wife, Honor. As a QC, the portly Sam was a well-known figure in Wembley and in the law courts, not for the same reason, I think. And there's a tribute to his fine legal brain in John Cooper's book on Jewish doctors and lawyers in England, 1890 to 1990. Sam's brother, David, was also well known as the second headmaster of Carmel College. But Sam's wife, Honor, was just as illustrious as senior economic advisor at the Treasury and a brilliant statistician. What were the chances that other women in the community were equally eminent? Honor could probably have worked out the odds. Wembley women should be better known. There's another research project in the making. Among those who had not to hide their light under a bushel are the children of Wembley parents who went on to become Rabbanim. In no particular order, Rabbi Martin Stamler, Philip Goodhart, Julian Sinclair, Yedidia Sinclair as he now is, Michael Leitner of Kinloss Shul, Alex Chapper, now at Borehamwood, Vivian Berman, of course, Sarah Gershony. Again, I think the number may well be unprecedented, but that's only a guess. And now, time for some music, and I want to take you back to the days when not only were we blessed with a series of wonderful chazanim, Reverends Klein and Mayor Lev and Steve Robbins and Alan Bright and Mark Goldman and Anthony Wolfson, but also the boy trebles who sometimes accompanied them. Foremost among them was Adam Willman, who now joins soloist David Rome and the choir to sing one of those specials that restored our attention on the high holy days.
Melech Yoshev ale kisei rachamim mitnaheg b'chasidut mochel avonot
That was Keil, Melech, Yoshev with soloist David Druce in an arrangement by the Cantorial's musical director Alan Friedman, followed by Mochel Avonis led by Adam Willman, who you may remember as Wembley's lead boy soprano and duetting with three of our chazanim, with Mark Goldman, who emigrated to Canada, and with our beloved Anthony Wolfson, who was also a teacher of Adam's at Northwest London Jewish Day School. Steve Robbins was Adam's singing teacher and introduced him to the Shul Choir. And in 1997, Steve and Adam sang Keil, Melech, Yoshev together with the Shul Choir on the BBC's Songs of Praise programme. I tell you, only the best from Wembley. The richest source of information about Wembley Shul is, of course, the Wembley Synagogue News, which you can find in the British Library, in the Brent Archives, and in what was the Nachum Goldman Museum of the Jewish Diaspora in Tel Aviv, now called the Museum of the Jewish People. The WSN was simply the best Shul magazine in the country. I keep saying this, but every time I say it's best, you can believe me. It was started in 1966 by Laurie Rosenbaum, who kept a low profile in the Shul. He wasn't largely known, but believed that his magazine should be highly visible and should report candidly. Gosh, something that other Shul magazines just don't do. Laurie had a team of volunteer journalists who wrote about the Shul, conducted interviews, and published opinion pieces. It wasn't all My Summer Holiday in Israel, or Memories of the East End, or An Interesting Shul in Kazakhstan. Quite remarkably, Laurie's commitment was supported by Rabbi Berman, the magazine's nominal publisher, who was willing to let the magazine reflect communal disputes. In the issue of July 1974, for example, the WSN reported that the farewell reception for Rabbi and Mrs. Berman in May had been held up by a bomb threat. In the same issue, we find a three-page story, about the outgoing warden, Charles Oster, attacking members of the Board of Management for flip-flopping on the honorary officer's recommendation of a replacement for Rabbi Berman. An editorial in the same edition lamented that the shul now had no minister, no chazan, no secretary, Rose Friedentag had just retired, no communal harmony, and only one warden. And I quote this, I think, because at the height of the shul's appeal, Wembley starts to become aware of tensions that would bedevil it in later years. And I think this is something that even in a celebration of Wembley, we have to explain. It's like the breaking of the glass in the simcha of a wedding. On the one hand, there was a fantastic level of activity in our community. On the other hand, there was a growing level of need, especially among elderly members. And on the third hand, can I say that? There were signs that fewer younger people were getting involved in the way that the founders of the shul had, a similar crisis to the one we face nationally. External factors were one cause. In 1965, 9 years earlier, the Local Government Act of 1963 had come into force, bundling Wembley and Willesden together to form Brent. What followed was a policy of social engineering and the relocating of public sector tenants from Willesden to more prosperous Wembley in the hope, it was alleged, of turning what had been a Conservative constituency into a Labour constituency. And this was marked by the council's purchase and demolition of Chalk Hill Road and the building of a housing estate that became notorious for crime, drugs, and prostitution. It turned the two shopping parades opposite Wembley Park Station into places where it was not a good idea to linger, and that put people off. The cost of Brent's policies raised rates in Brent, what we now call council tax, to the highest in the country, while rates in the neighbouring borough of Harrow, which included Stanmore, remained the lowest. Unsurprisingly, members started voting with their feet. What the WSN focused on was the effect of this, the sense that potential community leaders were not taking an active part in the shul, and it accused them of hiding behind excuses of business pressures to justify not coming forward and doing their bit. What the editorial was actually commenting on was a change not just in community attitudes but in demographics. The people who'd built the shul were mostly businessmen who'd lived a traditional lifestyle. A man worked 9 to 5 or 8 to 6, would come home to a supper lovingly cooked by his wife, and then go out for the evening to play cards with friends or go to a dance or the cinema, or spend time on shul activities and fundraising. Now, younger members were starting to go into the professions instead of into dance business. And the lifestyle was different, and I'm including myself in this. Men didn't necessarily come home at 6 in the evening, and if they did, there wasn't necessarily a cooked meal waiting for them. Their wife might well be working too, and she probably didn't want to cook meals for her husband. Let's be kinder, she might not want to. And one other difference, women, as well as having jobs, were now driving, which gave them a mobility outside the home that they hadn't had before. As far as our shul was concerned, I suppose that many of us felt we could take for granted the institution we'd grown up with. It didn't need building, only housework. And who likes doing housework? It was a bit like growing away from your parents. You felt guilty moving on, and you left them wondering what they'd done wrong. Did you not love them anymore? But you wanted to make your own way, on your own terms. The crisis in Wembley was not immediate, I'm not saying that. The level of activity remained very high, and I see that on one page of the Wembley Synagogue News in the early 1980s, the Society news page carried reports on 14 societies, all of them led by charismatic and energetic figures whose names we shouldn't forget. Pat Maisel, chair of the Education Committee, Keil. Alphonse Silverman, chair of CARE. Michael Teacher, chair of the Wembley Yavneh committee. Helen Reisman, chair of the Phoebe Welcome Leon group of Wheatsoe in succession to Barbara Preston. Stephen Conway and Michael Markson, chairs of the youth service. David Fine, chair of the Kosher Meals committee. Mrs. Roddy Gilbert, chair of Yavneh PTA. Corinne Van Colley, Corinne is somewhere here. Chair of the League of Jewish Women, a succession to Zelda Feinberg and Helen Green. Bernie Green, chair of the Functions Committee. Estelle Conway, chair at the time of the Litsoc. Jerry Grunberg, where are you, Jerry? Somewhere here. Chair of fundraising for the new Sinai School. And a while later, Anne Golby, chair of Jack, Stella Brown and Betty Carmel, co-chairs of the Amelie Jacobovitz Emuna. And note well, all of these chairs insisted on being called chairmen, whether men or women. Other members of our shul were involved with national organizations. At the US's Jewish Marriage Council, Carol Berenblatt was chairman of the Young Marrieds Department, Judy Bider was chairman of the Divorce Department, and Judith Cohen was chairman of the Marriage Education Department for the newly engaged. Gordon Spencer had been head of welfare and visitation at the US, became administrator at Ravenswood. Nettie Bayer was a children's worker with the ILEA for children at risk. Lionel Land was secretary of the Cashtras Commission. Trixie Barmel was national chairman of the JNF Traditional Fundraising Group. And then there are all the members of the committees playing their part behind the scenes, and the FRs and the HOs, all those heroic individuals who took on projects that had escaped the abilities of everyone else to solve. People like Seymour Soloway, who managed to solve the problem of why the heating system in Shul didn't work properly. Seymour solved it, one would never have guessed. Seymour solved it by opening vents. You see through there at the back. Seymour opened those vents in the back wall to ensure that there was a flow of air. There hadn't been a flow of air in the shul until then. Seymour worked out why the big lights overhead blew every time they were switched on, and he solved it by putting in dimmer switches. And Seymour was responsible for deciding that the area around the Aron Kodesh and the choir gallery, which had been painted an insipid pale blue, should instead be this warm, dark, dramatic blue, like the curtains which beautifully set off the woodwork and the gold embroidery. Little decisions like these had a big impact on the shul, alongside the more obvious tasks of educating and entertaining and fundraising and keeping the religious side of things working, like the way Joel Carmel ran the one-on-one seed learning program and the way people supported the daily minyan 3 times a day in the summer, morning, mincha, and night. It's hard to remember, but in 1980, the HOs had to warn the men in the community that they shouldn't assume that they'd get called up just because they were saying Kiddush. There was simply too much demand for aliyot. You'd only get an aliyah if your yahrzeit was for a parent and if you'd written a reminder to the shul office well in advance, in the words of the HOs. And even then, it was best to go up to the wardens, sitting in their box, in their top hats, and remind them because they couldn't be expected to recognize everyone. Which is why a lot of people only ever got Hagba or Gelila. And I remember being told that no one could expect an aliyah on a Shabbos morning unless they'd got to shul in time for Pesukei de Zimra. It was considered disrespectful. How things have changed. Today, one's grateful for anyone who turns up. In this context, praise deserves to be heaped on Brenda Hyman, who has done so much to keep things going. I'm not going to list all the activities that Brenda has been involved with. There are too many. But to get some perspective on her, in the time it takes me to rustle up a cheese sandwich, she continues to cook cordon bleu meals for family gatherings of 18. She did it last week. She and her gang, Jacqueline and Phil, make a fantastically effective team, and they are greatly to be congratulated and thanked. And if you look at the list of honorary officers on the wooden board in the front lobby, You'll see that the list stops at 2006 with the names Lee Lewis and Isaac Cohen, who took over from Brian Silver and Stuart Hart a couple of years earlier. Since then, no name has been added, and one greatly deserves to be. Probably not been added because Charles Vitesse is too modest to honour himself. But for 16 years, Charles has been the beating heart of Wembley Shul, and its survival for this long is testimony to his selfless dedication. It may be that those of us who left Wembley felt we could leave precisely because the Shul operated so well. We didn't notice the big committees all working away for our benefit. We felt free, many of us, to drift away to Stanmore, to Pinner, and after the Six-Day War of 1967 and the Yom Kippur of October 1973, to Israel. To begin with, it was very much the younger generation that made Aliyah, not the oldies, who were more rooted here. The Rurkers were among the first to go, 5 months before the 1967 war, do you remember? Young married Sandy and John Klieger went to Renana in the early 70s, followed shortly after by Jill and Ronnie Cole in 1977. For other families, it was the buying of a holiday flat that acted as a stepping stone to Aliyah. The Frankels bought a holiday flat, and the Sokovskis and the Silvermans and the Boxers and the Lewises and the Sinclairs and the Reismans. But often it was the children who made the first move. Michael Wilner and David Lipson just after the 67 war, Rachel Frankel, the Sklan children, Naomi, David and Judy, Sally and Claire Berenblatt, Jerry Maisel, Danny and Julia Hillman, Leonie Sheldon, Aviva and Ashley Coleman, Julian and Deborah Sinclair, Benji Reisman, Tanya and Atira Winchester, Sean Boxer. Some moved to Israel after finishing at school, others waited till they finished at university. Many, like Phil Hyman, moved with their B'nai Akiva group or some other group after planning Aliyah as a group. Interesting point, though, the children who made Aliyah were far from being hardline religious Zionists. Religious Zionism wasn't yet the big thing. Older members moved to Israel to be with the children or to retire or after a partner had died. These Wembley Olim weren't pioneers. They had a settled community of friends there already in Israel to make the transition easier, especially in Renana and Netanya Britannia, as they now call it. To a large extent, certainly up until now, this contingent in Israel has continued to think of itself as Wembley no longer in Galut, but back home. And two members, Hannah Gilman and Esther Miller, were actually living in Israel when they became vice chairman of Wembley Shul between 2003 and 2012. That's one way of getting out of sweeping up after a Kiddush. It's relatively easy to track who went from Wembley to Israel and why. It's less obvious to generalize about the rest of us, why some of us went to Edgware, others to Boreham Wood. Even before Willesden and Cricklewood and Dollis Hill shuls were closed, Wembley picked up those of their members who wanted to move further out, and we in turn lost members in this migration north and west. In those days, the suburbs were the Golden Medina. Very few of us moved back into London, and very few gravitated towards the big centres of Hendon and Golders Green, which must say something about how we saw ourselves religiously. Some, of course, left us for other reasons. Nigel Scheinwald, a year younger than me and at school with me, was knighted in 2000 and appointed British ambassador to Washington in 2007. His parents felt happier at a liberal synagogue where they could sit together, but he remembers his father doing security duty through the night here in the early 1960s because of the fear that we might be attacked by the National Front. It's our departure and those who went to Israel that explains why we're here this afternoon. But there's still a lot to say about what Wembley achieved in the face of all these pressures and changes. First, I want to ask David and the Cantorial Singers for a musical break.
Shomeir.
was Yismechu by Rabbi Yaakov Talmud, arranged by the Israeli-born American cantor Joseph Malavani, and sung with the choir by soloist Henry Black. The dire warnings that were observed in the Wembley Synagogue News in 1974 may have forced members to take stock, because within a couple of years the magazine reported on a new confidence. The shul now had a rabbi, Ivor Abrams, and a new chazan, and a new secretary, Mr. Lozowich, and a new headmaster of the Cheder, Rabbi Chaim Shmal, husband of the sister of Diane Kaplan, and it had a new Sefer Torah, and a new magazine editor, Tina Lent. Now, this is becoming difficult to continue pulling out names. There are so many. So this is the point where you have to shout out if you want a name check. For most of us here this afternoon, we're now at that stage in Wembley's history where we can pretty well remember for ourselves what happened, which means that we each have our own Wembley story to tell, and I wouldn't presume to tell you yours. As for my own story, I joined the choir when Lou Jackson took it over from Arnold Chazen in '67, a couple of years after my bar mitzvah. And I then conducted the choir many years later. I also did illustrations for various shul publications, and I edited the Wembley Synagogue News for a while in succession to Laurie Marks, who'd taken over from Laurie Rosenbaum, and who was followed by Tina Lent and Eric Pepper and Marilyn Nathans and Morris Wiseman. And my editorship was followed by David Simmons, and most recently, of course, by Brenda. But behind my own layer of memories are memories of my parents' participation in shul life. Sheila was the music teacher at Yavneh. David was a Brent counselor, and like Cyril Shaw, became a mayor of Brent. But in their spare time, Sheila and David were involved with the WSN. David would come up with thought-provoking essays about, say, why we ought to offer our But Heil girls a better deal. And both my parents played a vital part in the shul's entertainments, which meant Lit Sock, the Literary and Social Society, and its successor Grease Paint, and the Parent Teachers Association of Yavneh. Their shows at Purim brought together huge numbers of people. I quoted Marcel earlier, talking about how we were in and out of each other's homes. My memory is of trying to do my homework against a background of singing and hammy acting and hilarious laughter pouring out of our living room in Beechcroft Gardens, where rehearsals were held for 12 weeks each year from January to March. The shows were written by Eric Lent and my father, and the amazing Howard Wolfin, seen here, who could do everything. He sang, he acted, he played the piano effortlessly, he directed, and like Jeffrey Schisler, he was a member of the Magic Circle. And he left a massive gap in our lives when he died totally unexpectedly one Tuesday evening while playing eight-a-side football. That phenomenon of early deaths, especially among the men, was something else I remember at Wembley. Rabbi Abrams, for example, was a very heavy smoker. But there was also the phenomenon of members surviving thanks to progress in multiple bypass surgery. Men, it was usually men who could barely breathe, would have a catastrophic heart attack, get saved by open heart surgery, come back to shul saying they felt better than they'd done in years, and take up golf. It was a pattern. Among those middle-aged men who didn't make it and left us too soon were Myrna Glass's brother Barry Weinberg, who sang second tenor in the choir and wrote some very clever jazz-inflected arrangements for us. And the three Stanleys, do you remember? Stanley Brudney, Stanley Conn, and Stanley Udolph, all friends, all dying within a few weeks of each other. And Stanley Udolph, I used to babysit his child. Stanley Udolph, I remember, had a mortal terror of reaching the age of 40 and failed to do so by 3 weeks. We miss so many others too. Jenny Wiseman, Edith Andresia, who ran the shul office for a while, and Jonathan Fine, all died far too young. And Ronnie Marks and Max Weintraub, so many, too many. And then there were the children who left us much too soon. Richard Skovron died while out jogging. Ruth Wolkenfeld in a car crash. My brother Jonty and Giles Van Colley, wickedly killed by an employee who first blew up his car and then murdered him as he was leaving his optician's practice in Mill Hill. Giles had been utterly devoted to Wembley and would have gone on to become one of the leaders of Anglo Jewry had he survived. We miss him to this day, as we miss so many others.
Shomeir Yisroel Shemo She'erit
Shomeir Yisroel, the David Roman soloist, composed by Shmuel Ullman, who was born in Russia in 1877, ended up as chazan at Duke's Place and then the Hampstead Synagogue in West End Lane. Remarkable. It's important that in all this memorializing, we don't forget to honor these names as well. They colored the sound that we're used to. Now, as for Howard Wolfin, Why he died so young is hard to understand. He was active and he didn't smoke. What he did do was make us happy and make us laugh. And the first show he directed for us was a London version of Fiddler on the Roof in which he played Tevye, the herring seller from Hessel Street. That was in 1979. Wembley shows typically were spoofs on other shows. Oi Claudius in 1980, West End Story instead of West Side Story in 1983, Fanny Get Your Gun in 1986, about the Jewish cowboys of Salt Beef City, featuring here Hetty, Yeti, and Nettie. And all depended on the acting and singing talents of Roberta Sugarman, Joe Scovran, Jill Blue, Diane Lazarus, David Rurker, John Klieger, Jack Coleman, Marvin Ellison, Geraldine Kinchuk, Philip Shipman, Barbara Hart, Bernie and Fanny Noble, Barbara Williams, Jackie Kay, John Tye, Ronnie Marks, Jonathan Fine, Jerome Cohen, with backstage support from Audrey Soskin, Ruth and Leo Eisenfeld, Judy Whitefield, and Joan and Julia Hillman, with Daphne Coleman and Stephen Glass and Howard Wolfin playing the piano, and the Functions Committee, hooray, providing meals in the interval. These shows and others like them, 40s on Parade, Megillah, The Wedding, Salad Days, Hello Dolly, were always highlights of Wembley's year. They contributed much needed funding to the Shul's coffers and much enjoyed humour to our armoury of jokes, and jokes of quite surprising sauciness, I find, looking back at the scripts, and quite surprising displays of leg, as Roberta's cut-off jeans and Jill's black tights could testify. In addition to these shows were the old-time music hall evenings, sometimes with songbooks shared with the audience, and sometimes with local adaptations of old favourites like Wembley, Wembley, here we come, right back where we started from, where pretty committees bloom in the spring. Each morning at dawning, Reverend Robin sings and Rabbi Berman tells us don't be late for that very special date. Mariv starts at 5 to 8. Oh, good old Wembley, here we come. Thank you. A quite different aspect of Wembley volunteer life was that of social action and its astonishing expansion, because we were already running a kosher school meal service from the kitchen, and Friedel Radbill realized that the shul was in a position to set up a kosher Meals on Wheels service. And this was so successful that Brent agreed to fund it, to pay for a team of dedicated kitchen staff, and to refurbish the kitchen, which was then opened by our strangely Dickensian MP Rhodes Boyson, he of the mutton chop whiskers and advocacy of caning. Yes. At its height, the kosher Meals on Wheels service, which served Wembley, Kenton, Kingsbury, and Queensbury, was making 25,000 deliveries a year. And not just of food, but smiles and friendship, and at Yom Tov little extras like honey cake and cheesecake and Hamantaschen. Eventually Brent stopped subsidising our operation and took the service under its own roof, only supplying vegetarian meals to those who wanted them. But out of Meals on Wheels grew Wembley CARE, the Wembley Care Society, CARE, C-A-R, Care and Responsibility for the Elderly, which, if it was still in operation, would this year be celebrating its 50th anniversary. CARE had 3 aims and achieved 2 of them. The first was a day centre for the elderly and housebound, which operated twice a week from the Scout Hut in Brook Avenue, which was leased from London Transport. It offered fresh hot lunches from the Shul kitchen, exercise classes, a hairdresser, entertainments, guest speakers, outings and friendship, and soon there was a very long list of people wanting to join. Later, under the guidance of Miriam Lewis, the day centre moved to the Sephardi community's Edinburgh House. Edinburgh House wanted daytime activities for its own residents and had the advantage of medically trained staff on site. So the centre operated there for several years as the Friedel Radbill Day Centre, run by paid helpers and volunteers, with volunteer drivers and additional transport provided by Brent, until Edinburgh House fell into financial troubles and the centre was shut down. That was number 1. CARE's second venture, and when I say CARE's second venture, I really mean Friedel's second venture, was the Luncheon Club, mostly for elderly, widowed men. For years, it met in the big room next to the kitchen. And then, when part of that room was turned into the Beis HaMedrash by the Stamler children in memory of Sam and Honor, it moved to the hall. I think there's a plaque commemorating that. CARE's third aim was to build sheltered accommodation, but alas, that plan never came to fruition, although one's tempted to say, thank goodness. I'd say Friedel had quite enough on her plate, as did her many diners. That's a joke. Oh, come on, give me a bit more. Thank you. To her great fortune, what she did achieve happened because by 1972, the Shul had paid off the cost of the building. Isn't that extraordinary? And it had some spare cash, not words one often hears about shuls these days. Joe Chilton and Dick Savinson suggested funding the needs of the elderly in the community and turned to Friedel, who'd been a nurse and a matron of the Otto Schiff House in Hampstead and had huge experience looking after the elderly. In all her ventures, she was supported by Alf Silverman and Charles Oster, and what she achieved went on to inspire other shuls, which is why I'm spelling it out. This is really important stuff. It's not just, what we've done here. It's the ripple effects of what went out from Wembley that needs to be recorded. She inspired other shuls who asked her advice on how to set up meal delivery services and day centres of their own and how to organise delivery rotas. How did we organise delivery rotas? In her case, David Simmons wrote a special computer program to solve the question of who needed to take food where. As the royal patron of day centres, Princess Alexandra presented Friedel with an Unsung Hero Award in 1987 at a gala dinner at the Intercontinental Hotel on Park Lane. As far as Wembley is concerned, Friedel deserved congratulations also for managing to remain an active member of the Ladies' Guild and a sister of B'nai B'rith Leo Beck Lodge while doing everything else. A host of social activities raised funds for Wembley CARE, but there was no shortage of other deserving causes. There were groups that raised money for needy causes in Israel, that put on guest lectures, concerts of music and Yiddish theatre, Melava Malkas and quiz nights. Operation Wheelchair, picture there, raised money for rehabilitation equipment for wounded IDF soldiers. The Phoebe Welcome Leon group of Witzo carried out projects like refitting a creche in Katamon, which it named after Esther Ryman, who used to knit kippot for members of the community. The B'nai B'rith Jerusalem Lodge raised money for the Hillel Foundation and medical aid in Israel. Northwest London Friends of Magen David Adom raised funds for Israel's ambulance service. Wembley JNF helped to develop Israel's forests and schools and worked on projects to make the Galil more habitable. Other volunteers dedicated themselves to the interests of Jews in the diaspora. Martin Aaron ran a society to support children with autism and learning difficulties. Amelie Jakobowitz Emuna, part of Mizrahi, helped with child resettlement in the religious community. The Friendship Club provided a program of activities for our older members and was kept running even after her 100th birthday by Clarice Offstein. Vivian Freeman chaired the Soviet Jury Committee in succession to David Frankel and Maury Berenblatt and tried to find ways to provide tangible and moral support to Jews trapped and violated in the Soviet bloc and to give voice to their cause. And Vivian tells me that on one occasion, when members of the Soviet Jury Committee were flying to Russia, they and their luggage were given a lift to Heathrow by Mr. Mansigani. Now, who was Mr. Mansigani? Yes, Ranish Mansigani, who'd taken over Leslie's. Then there was the Ladies' Guild, of course, formed in the 1930s by Deborah Sadie, who brought in the young Beth Kuttner, and the young Mrs. Vennett, and the young Mrs. Benson, and the young Josie Berman, the rabbi's wife, as helpers. About 100 women would meet each week for keep fit classes, knitting classes, guest speakers, and card games and theatre visits. There are also annual luncheons with celebrity guests like the radio personality, there's Anona Wynne, and the novelist Barbara Cartland, Princess Diana's stepmother, and Roy Plumley, the creator of Desert Island Discs. Much of this activity continued under the chairmanship of Mrs. Berman, and then Rose Friedentag, and subsequently our beloved Maureen Rose, who reminds me that in addition to preparing the weekly Kiddushim, the Ladies Guild continued to hold its luncheons with guest speakers and to dress the Shul Sukkah. I'm nearly at the end of my story. You know, that's rabbi code for I'm halfway through. I'm not. And I've left till last what I think was the greatest achievement of Wembley Shul, and it is exactly the thing that the chief rabbi mentioned at the end of his words: the raising of a new generation. You've heard that our kindergarten started in 1954. 9 years later, in 1963, we launched our own primary school, also in the classrooms at the back of the ladies' gallery up there. Posters advertising the school had gone up in local shops. There was one in the window of Grudzinski's. Did you remember that there was a Grudzinski's round here? Where was it? Preston Road, opposite Leslie's. Myrna Glass heard about it, and being a trained infants teacher, she went and met Rabbi Berman and got hired for the job. 2 head teachers in succession got hired, then got married, and then left. And Myrna was left holding the fort. She continued to be senior mistress until a visiting Department of Education and Science inspector asked Charles Arnold, the chairman of the governors, what her title was, and he immediately promoted her to headmistress. Clever move. There was growing demand for Jewish education at the time and not enough supply. For Wembley parents, the most accessible school was North West London Jewish Day School, because it was just 3 stops down the line at Willesden Green Station. There was also Solomon Wolfson, which had been started in 1860 by members of the Bayswater Synagogue for the children of, I quote, our poorer brethren. It moved to Ladbroke Grove in the 1930s, but was harder to get to from here, as was Rosh Pina in Edgware. Solly bussed children from Wembley, Kenton and Kingsbury, but Charles Arnold and other members wanted us to have our own school and wanted the borough of Wembley to fund it. That might have happened if Wembley and Willesden hadn't merged. But after 1965, Brent argued that Solomon Wolfson was already the borough's Jewish day school, and there wasn't a need for another one, which meant that when Yavneh was founded, it had to rely on other sources of funding, notably the Education Department of JNF, and covenants and local fundraising. And you may remember this little publication, one of the little money-making ventures that Yavneh cooked up. Discussions with Brent did continue, however, about the need for a larger state-funded Jewish primary school in the area, and in 1973 a site was found off the Mall in Shakespeare Drive, and in 1981 the Michael Sobel Sinai School opened. Here are, well, Rabbi Berman and Rabbi Abrams and Jerry over there on the right, with Chief Rabbi Manuel Chekhovovitz, looking on at the model of Sinai School and feeling very hopeful. And it became the main feeder for JFS, which then moved from Camden to the site next door. And as a former governor at Sinai, I'm proud to have been responsible for finding the architects to build its extension 20 years ago. Now, we in Wembley hoped that the arrival of Sinai and JFS would lead to a rebirth of Wembley. It didn't. Maybe the schools were too far away from 40 Avenue, or from Kenton Shul, or from Kingsbury Shul, to do us any good. And by the time Noam's school rented space here, it was too late. Yavneh, however, was right here at the center of our community during our heyday, run by our people and for our people. And what it achieved was miraculous. Under Myrna, and I'm terribly sorry Myrna is not here today, she had wanted so much to be, she seems to have a fractured vertebrae, and she is at home trying to recover. Under Myrna, who lived and still lives a couple of 100 yards away, Oakington Avenue, a wonderful team of teachers came together, amplified by Israeli teachers funded by the Sochnut. I think Myrna got the balance just right for our needs, making the school a happy, productive place for its pupils, none of whom could ever have known just how tight the funding always was, even when at the end of each day everything had to be tidied away in specially made cupboards on wheels, do you remember? So that the same rooms could be used for Cheder on Sunday mornings and Monday and Wednesday nights, and for the youth service on Friday night. If you want to remind yourself at last what Yavneh meant and what Wembley Shul meant, each has an active Facebook page. But because I'm telling the story, what I remember best is Yavneh's music making and Myrna's support for it. Music that was a clever blend of Jewish and secular, just as all Yavneh's classes were. I remember its amazing production of Andrew Lloyd Webber's Joseph and the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat in '73, and the schools that the children learnt from the BBC's Radio for Schools broadcasts. And I remember it winning a trophy in the Brent Music Festival at the Conference Centre on Empire Way. Remember the Conference Centre? Do you remember the 10-pin bowling? And do you remember the squash courts there? And Yavneh Choir's participation in JNF concerts organised by Reverend Reuben Turner at Alexandra Palace and the Queen Elizabeth Hall. I also remember how every year in the spring, a crocodile of little children would file out of the building and walk along the street and through the alley and into my parents' garden so they could see the newly hatched tadpoles. Like newly hatched tadpole children looking at newly hatched tadpole frogs. It was very sweet. Little Stephen Wilson, who went on to become chief executive of the United Synagogue, and tiny Rachel Fink, who's now the chief executive of the Spanish and Portuguese Sephardi community after having been head teacher of JFS and Hasmonean Girls. Both would, I'm sure, say that Myrna was an inspiration. And finally, Yavneh was only Myrna's day job. She was also involved with Lit Sock and Grease Paint and the Function Committee and, of course, the Yavneh Parents Committee, Parents Association. And I've managed to ferret out a video of the production Fanny Get Your Gun, which she acted in and co-produced with Eric Lint in 1986. The quality of the recording isn't great. The quality of the performance, sensational.
Es ist